like to introduce now Greg Hymowitz, and because let's talk about people who have capital and then talk about the other situation. If you'd like to talk from your chair, you're welcome.
Yeah,
come up here.
I'm going to be so brief that it's not worth the time to stand up and walk over there. My name is Greg Hymowitz. I manage a company called Interest Capital. We manage about $5 billion in hedge fund assets for about 150 institutions. And we're actually the largest provider of fund-of-fund services to the Taft-Hartley community. I'll be very brief because I was just asked to talk about what we're seeing out there. And I will tell you that while we're up 31% this year, like much of Wall Street's having a very good year, we actually are very nervous. And we are cautioning our investors, the 150 institutions that we manage money for, to be very, very conservative. And let me very briefly tell you what we see out there. And I actually, for those of you who know me, I'm a big optimist, so take that for what I'm about to say, because I think the picture out there is fairly grim going forward. They called 2008 the credit crisis for one reason, and that was the fact that the economy, and I'll talk more broadly because I'm no expert in New York State, so I'll talk more broadly about the U.S. economy and global economy, was massively over-leveraged, massively. And what has to happen now is a massive deleveraging. Unfortunately, we're very minimally through it. In fact, I was in San Francisco a few weeks ago talking to one of our managers, who's probably the second or third largest hedge fund in the world. And I asked him in a meeting, I said, what inning do you think we are in the deleveraging cycle? And I thought he'd tell me, top of the seventh, bottom of the seventh, something like that. He told me he thinks we're at the top of the second, which is pretty scary. And the one thing I was sort of not factoring in when I was having a conversation with him is the following, and no one's really brought it up yet this morning, so let me sort of give you a mention of it. From now until probably 2016, there's roughly $3 trillion of commercial real estate loans that need to be refinanced. The leverage that was put onto this economy in those vintage years of, call it 2001 to 2006, was enormous. To give you an example, I'm sure you've all heard of the term credit default swaps, CDS. It's basically, think about it as insurance policies on debt. It's ultimately what brought AIG down. At the peak, there was $60 trillion of credit default swaps, $60 trillion of insurance. The only problem was there's only $6 trillion of corporate debt outstanding. So it gives you some sense of the magnitude, the side bets, the speculation, the leverage that was going on in the economy, which ultimately brought down many, many banks, Lehman, Bear, and obviously AIG as well. So we have to work through this deleveraging, and it's going to be painful. There is roughly, between 2005 and 2007, half of all the world's private equity ever raised was invested. This is a Financial Times statistic. Between 2005 and 2007. $1.5 trillion was put into private equity, which, when I first started my career as an attorney at Skadden before I was at Goldman, we used to call LBOs. But Wall Street has a unique way of changing the names of anything that's going bad. So it went from LBOs to private equity, and trust me, it will find its new name in the next couple of years. That $1.5 trillion that was invested was then levered 4 to 5 times. Those loans are what we call levered loans. They used to be called LBO debt. Again, we changed the name, called levered loans. Most people believe that $1.5 trillion that was invested between 2005 and 2007, those vintage years, that equity is worthless. It's a zero. So, what we have to work through over the next couple of years is massive amounts of corporate debt, and then also the big number, which I think from a New York State perspective is going to be the most painful part, the commercial real estate debt. It's bank debt, it's mezzanine debt, it's private debt. And then the other scary statistic, I know it's beyond the reach of this conversation or the purpose of this meeting, which is, I guess, New York State, is sovereign debt. If you read the New York Times over the last, I think it was 2 days ago, the front cover of the business section with the big red letters said debt. And if you read the article, it was all about sovereign debt. Just to give you an example, The United States last year had 33% of its public debt due within 1 year. Today, because of all the government relief programs, that number is now 45%. Sovereign nations around the world, as a percentage of their GDP, their public debt is astronomical. Japan is at 198%. The U.S. public debt is 44%, including corporate debt, it's about 66% of GDP. The amount of money that's been pumped into the system, unfortunately, has increased the leverage in the system. It's sort of the weird ironies of this whole thing, and if you read about, Bernanke and how he thinks you get out of this problem, and I'm not saying he's wrong, but basically we have to reflate the bubble. So how do you get out of massive amounts of leverage? Well, unfortunately, you just lever up more. It's very, I think, extremely, extremely scary. And then we all can sort of speculate on what that means for the dollar, and ultimately what it means for, my children, my grandchildren, who are ultimately going to have to pay for this. So, I said in the beginning we're very optimistic, or I'm a very optimistic person, but I got to tell you, if you look back in the history of the 30s, there were many rallies before the big fall. And unfortunately, a lot of them, easy money was made this year on Wall Street. Companies did in 2008 through 2009 massive cost cutting. If you cut your expenses and your revenues stay flat, you make more money. You can only cut your expenses so much. It's not a way of growing your business ultimately. So with commercial real estate problems, with the private equity problems that need to be fixed, and then ultimately with the sovereign debt problems and the issues of the dollar, we think it's going to be a very, very, very difficult couple of years. And obviously I spent most of my life traveling around the country visiting Taft-Hartley plans and public plans when I managed money for it. And then you have this whole issue, which no one's mentioned either, which I'll just touch on in 1 second, which is just simply pension reform. The 150 pension plans I manage, from the leading international unions in D.C. to the locals here in New York, are in a great deal of pain. And look, we all know you can't cut benefits all that much, and you can't increase contributions all that much. So there needs to be significant pension relief in Washington, and my understanding is that's something high on the agenda right now, but obviously D.C. has other things, front and center right now. So I think there's a lot of problems out there.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Gary.
Okay, sure.